So I think you'd be great on Twitter.
And he'd be posting in Elfish, so who could argue?
Nobody would know what he was talking
What
about.
is that guy saying?
Who knows more about war than a man who served in both world wars? Let's talk about J.R.R. Tolkien with author Graham McAleer.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
And in turn, I welcome you. We're so glad you're here. In case you're wondering, I'm Steve, the aforementioned old white guy. Matthew Porter is our executive producer, and he's here. Matthew has a tendency to lose things, mostly arguments. But he's never lost one with me. When Matthew speaks, I take it as from Sinai and do not question. I simply do what he says.
He wants something, Matthew.
No.
He can have whatever he wants after that.
Jeremy, our producer, is in the little glass booth. Jeremy, how's your band? By the way, he did an album for ESPN, and that's being played on air all over the country.
You're going to see a whole bunch on Christmas Day. I'm just saying, little spoiler alert. NBA games.
And you wrote the music, arranged it, and used even a couple of traditional ones, right?
And I played a whole lot of banjo.
All right.
And our one-man IT department, John Myers, is in the tech bunker. John's light show at Christmas is so bright, well, you can easily see each of his neighbors' ticked off faces. And Dr. George Bingham is the president of Key Life. George reminds you, if you get too cold this month, nothing gives you a warm feeling like making a tax-deductible donation to Key Life. And Kathy Wyatt is the soft feminine side of the program. Are you doing the gingerbread houses this year?
Not in the same way as before. It was a little much this year to take on, so no.
And all of those children.
The cooking still continues, though, yes? The baking?
The cooking and the
The
baking
ministry of your
continues,
baking?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe just for tiny houses.
That's really all I care about.
Yeah, that's right. So long as we get gingerbread, we're perfect.
You don't even like gingerbread.
No, you're right. That and I don't like pumpkin pie, and I'm not big on Christmas, to be perfectly honest with you.
Aren't you all glad
for the
you don't
cookies.
work here?
Listen, I'm the host. I'm going to change the subject.
All
okay.
All right.
We have a great guest, and I've been looking forward to that. This is Dr. Graham McAleer, and he's a professor of philosophy at Loyola University, where he's taught for 30 years. He is also a member of the Judicial Ethics Committee of the state of Maryland. He contributes to the national online magazine, Law and Liberty, writing about culture and politics. His latest book, which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, is titled Tolkien, Philosopher of War. Now, there are two things that I want to make clear. That I like this program because I carry a gun. And I realize that as a Christian, you have to be careful where you use it. If you're persecuted for Christ, you just got to take it. But if it's random or if it's war, you can kill those suckers and do it biblically. I just wanted you to know. And secondly, Graham is an amazing scholar, and I was trying to find a nice way to say it. You got to keep the fodder down low, and then Kathy chimed in and said, that's because we're not that bright. So Graham, welcome to this program, and thank you for writing this book. I've been reading it this morning, and I absolutely love it.
Thanks. Thanks for those nice comments. And I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Did you, is this a lifelong love for you, Tolkien? I mean, this isn't something you just thought up last year, is it?
No, it's not something I thought up last year, but I'm not a lifelong Tolkien fan. I was really turned on to him by the films, like a lot of people, I think. I mean, obviously I knew about him, right? But I only really started studying him in light of the films, the Peter Jackson films, and that was in many ways under interest from students, because when the Jackson films came out, the student interest was just enormous. At least at Loyola, where I teach, it was absolutely enormous. So, I thought, okay, well, let's try and meet the students where they're at. And so I started really getting into Tolkien. But then, it has become a passion subsequently, for sure.
Oh, yeah. I think, listen, this is not a simple book, by the way, but if you love Tolkien, you're going to love this book. But you can't, it's not, you don't read it as a children's story for your kids. And it's probably, unless you have a small group of academics, it's probably not going to be good for a small group study. But then it could change your life. It could make you a warmonger, kind of like me. If you know. It is a misnomer, isn't it, to say that maybe you ought to tell us there may be somebody left in the universe who has no idea what we're talking about. So maybe you ought to introduce us to Tolkien and maybe the Fellowship of the Ring, kind of in a way we can understand, and then we'll get to some of these questions.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of an interesting comment, right? That it's hard to think that there maybe are people on the planet who don't know Tolkien, right? Because he has become, and maybe in a strange way, he has become part of the popular discourse, right? I mean, people mention Gollum, Gandalf, Frodo, people in all sorts of circumstances, right? Something that I mentioned in the book that has totally fascinated me in a lot of official documents from the Ukrainian government in the war, they mention the orcs. They tend to use the word orcs for the Russians. And these are official documents, right? This is not telegram channels with soldiers just like, oh, the orcs are coming, right? No, this is official documents. So this is one thing that has sort of astonished me about Tolkien, the way that he has sort of seeped into the culture, despite the fact that he's perhaps not, he's not a central object of study in the universities. I mean, university professors much prefer modernism, poetry, and stuff like that, right? So, he's a bit of on the one hand, he's a bit outside of the universities, but he is utterly part of the culture. And so who was he, right? And this, I think, is a very fascinating question because he would strike many today as quite a peculiar man. In terms of his Catholicism, he's very peculiar in that modern Catholicism isn't anything really like the Catholicism that Tolkien grew up with, right? I mean, when Tolkien was alive, the idea of the Catholic Church as the church militant, for example, right? This idea, no Catholics use that phrase, the church militant, probably for 50, 60 years. So, he's a strange character in that regard. He was an English nationalist. He was thoroughly committed to fighting wars for England. He believed in England. He loved England, but he was very hostile to the British Empire, for example. So some of the people who love Tolkien today would be astonished at the man, right? They would find him quite peculiar. He believed in ghosts. He believed in demons. He had an extraordinarily rich spiritual life. It was a central part of his daily practice. He was a conservative man. He got 3 newspapers each day in England, and they were all the conservative newspapers. So, many of the people who really, like the hipsters in America, right, who love Tolkien, I think would be deeply shocked if they actually sat with the man. So this kind of raises the conundrum, right? Why is it that people love him so much? Why has he entered the popular culture? And that, of course, has something to do with the character creations, the depth of the world that he created, the languages, the story arc, and the fact that I think also that deep things are being discussed I mean, on the one hand, right, the story kind of moves ahead. It's about battles, it's about wars, it's about sacrifice. But at the same time, I think there are very, very deep things. And I think people intuitively are interested in deep things. And Tolkien's a beautiful vehicle for that.
He is. He created another world, an entire world with its own language, its own mores, its own. It was amazing. Would it be fair? And we're coming up to the end of this segment, so maybe we'll have to get into it later. You might say a word. Is it fair that overall it is not a metaphor, but a story, a saga of good against evil?
I think that's right. But I think so. That's absolutely correct. And there are a lot of subtleties involved in that. Sometimes Tolkien is criticized, especially in university circles, as, oh, it's too black and white. There's no gray areas. But actually, I think he's a very keen psychologist. And there are some very beautiful moments of sort of moral ambiguity in the books. And it's not a uplifting, rah-rah story, right? It's actually more or less a story of a long defeat and the way that people relate to that sort of pain and that suffering and the atonements they sometimes have to make for bad choices made in the past. So I think it is a story of good and evil, but not in any formulaic way, I would say.
Oh, guys, you're going to love this. If you go anywhere, you're a fruitcake. This is going to be a great discussion. And if you've read Tolkien and you've been moved by it, you're going to be moved by the next 45 minutes. So don't leave, but we're going to leave for a little bit. We're going to have some cookies and milk because this is hard work. And then, like Jesus, we're going to return. So glad you're here. You always have a place at our table. We're talking with author and Professor Graham McAleer, and I told him that when I go into an academic institution, even though I taught there for a long time, I break out in hives, having run away from kindergarten, and it was a struggle thereafter. But if he were my professor, I just want you to know I would sit at his feet and learn some important things. But his book, and it is a great book, especially if you love Tolkien, and what is there not to love? It's called Tolkien, Philosopher of War.
Graham, I was reading the preface, and I wanted to repeat a quote that you have there, and this may not be the best of questions, but you mentioned Janet Cross' book, War and the Works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And there's a quote here where you said, Tolkien's distaste for contemporary war can also be traced to his understanding of the causes and agonies of modern war neurosis. And then you said, modern technology generated Tolkien's dislike of all modern war and preference for earlier models of military conflict. And when I read that, it just jumped out at me because I thought, what on earth was modern technology in Tolkien's day? I mean, we tend to think that now we are besieged with so much technology that's changing every day. What the heck was modern technology in his day that would have affected his position on this?
And he disagreed with her, didn't he?
Yeah, so that's a quote from Janet Cross, and I think it's very conventional take on Tolkien, right?
Right.
That he's a Luddite. He doesn't like the modern world. He dislikes modern technology, and I think the story is much more complicated than that.
Yeah, and
So,
you mentioned that, but I was just interested in what was modern technology back then, because that was a long time ago now.
Right. So let me give one example, right? So one thing, he was not a wealthy man at all, right? He was more or less poor much of his life, and he struggled horribly to be
Yeah.
able to pay the family bills. He had four children. He was an orphan, so he had no
Huh.
family money or anything like that. And so he lived off his academic salary. His wife didn't work. So, he's not like in a gilded cage or anything like that in the universities of Oxford, and he's not like that at all, right? So it was really hard for him to make ends meet. But when the books came out, he started to earn quite a lot of money. If you read his letters, he's actually hilarious, right? He's really kind of hard-nosed about his business deals, because he wants money. He lives a life of poverty, and
I
he wants to
like
be
him.
paid for what's his. So it's very, very funny to read the letters in this regard. But one thing he wanted to do as the money came in, he wanted to buy a typewriter that had been specially made with Elvish letters so that he could type directly into Elvish on the typewriter.
Wow.
So there's a technology, and he even wanted that technology sort of amplified, right? He wanted it to be able to have new fonts and stuff like this. So, he was not against technology, and there's a kind of a new technology. He used biro pens, for example. He didn't use, classic ink pens. I mean, he did use ink pens, of course, right? But, he wasn't averse to biro pens. And of course, in terms of his experience of war, uh, then this is kind of what a lot of people think about when they give this sort of classic idea that, if you've been at the other end of a machine gun, then there's nothing romantic about that. There's nothing medieval about that, right? So in medieval war, you knew your man, right? You knew that as you got closer to your man, his sword might hit you. Well, in modern warfare, sometimes they call it invisible death, right? Where you can be struck by a sniper. And this was very important to him, right? Because he was a signals officer in the First World War, and they were prime targets for sniper fire, because on the battlefield, knowledge is crucial. So the signals officer is the one in charge of conveying the knowledge between the generals and the troops, etc. And so snipers were constantly trying to disrupt them by killing the signals officer. So that's a good example of invisible death, right? Where somebody, kills you from hundreds of yards away and you've no clue they're even there. So that's the kind of technology that people are thinking that, he's sort of very hostile to. And it's certainly true, technologies, only rudimentary technologies appear in the sort of battles and wars that, he wrote about. But I don't think we can read from that into some kind of general dislike of the modern world or something like that. Another funny thing about him, right? Another thing he wanted to do as soon as the money came in, he wanted to buy some handmade shoes, right? So he wasn't against luxury or technology as we would understand it. But and also the other thing about that, right, that I think is very important, at least I cannot find evidence that he was traumatized by the First World War. He got very, very sick. He got trench fever, right? So he was invalided out. And he was in hospital for basically 2 years. But although we tend to think of the First World War as introducing the whole era of war trauma, and that was definitely a thing, don't get me wrong, that was definitely a thing. But at least in his letters, he speaks, I wouldn't say fondly of war by any means, but so far as I can tell, he didn't regret it. And he was very proud of his regiment. He was in the Lancashire Fusiliers, and they were one of the most decorated regiments in the British Army in the First World War. And he was tremendously proud of his time in the regiment. And he says to one of his sons, so two of his sons went to fight in the Second World War, and he says to one of them in a letter, he says, the army is as good a training in life as is Oxford University. Right. So again, this is an interesting thing about him, I think. Kathy, does that help with that?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, but I get that he was not against modern technology, but I simply cannot picture him on Facebook or Twitter, X. That does something to the image. So if you think he would be on those, don't tell me. It will absolutely ruin my entire day.
I think he might have been right, but he'd be one of these characters on Twitter or X, right, who's a curmudgeon.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true.
Like, very much sort of being very much a contrarian, right? So I think it'd be great on Twitter.
And he'd be posting in Elfish, so who could argue? I mean,
Nobody would know what he was talking
What
about.
is that guy saying?
Hey, listen, we don't have time to ask another question in this segment. We'll do it in the next. We could have a hymn sing or a prayer service, but we're probably not. So we're going to back out. We're going to rest up, and you got to get this book. Tolkien, the Philosopher of War. That doesn't sound politically correct to me. And it isn't in a lot of ways, but it's informative and life-changing. So get this book. Spend the time that it takes to read it, and you'll rise up and call me blessed for having told you about it. Now, one other thing to tell you. Don't you dare go anywhere. Hey, thanks for joining us. We're glad you're here. We're hanging out with author and professor Dr. Graham McAleer. And after all the nonsense I said about Facebook and Twitter and X, you can find him there on lawliberty.org, or you can also find him on X at Bespoke Ethics, BESPOKEETHICS.
Love it. Graham, I wanted to go back to something you said earlier about the kind of maybe more overlooked gray areas of Tolkien's writings. Obviously, anybody who's seen the Lord of the Rings movies know they're these powerful battle scenes, and it very easily is clearly delineated good versus evil. I just found a clip, different franchise, the culmination of the Avengers Marvel series, and it was not just a clip of the final battle, but it was a clip from the theater where everybody is squaring off and all the pieces are being set for this final battle, and you just hear the crowd's just going nuts, and it creates in us, I think, when there's a great story of good versus evil, it just affects us on a visceral, primal kind of level, and I think we resonate with that clear good versus evil. But again, beyond that, you had mentioned that that's not necessarily a definitive take on Tolkien's writings. Could you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you're absolutely correct. That is the kind of the architecture of it, right? I mean, you've got the Shire has to be defended, right? And the Shire is the thing that we love about Tolkien. He himself said of himself he was a hobbit. And, we love that idea of, smoking a pipe, sitting in the garden, drinking beer, the green and pleasant land, right? We love that. And then on the other hand, right, you've got this kind of blasted out, sterile environment of the tyrant Sauron, right? So that's the deep framework. But then you've got characters like Gollum, right? Who there's this moment. So Tolkien said that the true hero of the books was Sam. But there's a moment when Sam is the cause of the final loss of Gollum. So Gollum is slowly becoming more like a hobbit. He was a hobbit originally.
Yeah.
But the ring destroys him. But under his sort of relationship with Frodo, Gollum starts to come back into something more like his original form, right, as a hobbit. And But you might recall from the books that Sam is always very hostile to Gollum. He thinks Gollum cannot be trusted. He calls him Stinker. And there's a moment when, and it's very beautifully described, Tolkien has Gollum reaching out to pat the knee of a sleeping Frodo. So it's this gesture of gentleness, and and this is so unusual, right? Because Gollum, the way we meet Gollum is, right, he's eating raw fish and stuff like this, and he's a murderer, and he wants to kill all Bagginses, right? But there's this very sweet moment when he's sort of wanting just to pat the knee of the sleeping Frodo, and Sam sees it, and Sam thinks Frodo's going to attack. Sorry, that he's going to attack
Right.
Frodo, and he says to Gollum, keep away, Stinker, don't you dare touch my friend. And it's that actually what happens, as Tolkien describes it, is that Gollum just then completely retreats into his shell, and it says the light leaves his eyes, and at that point, the trajectory of Gollum into his sort of death and loss is sealed, but sealed by the hero, right, Sam. Right. And so the problem about Sam, again, right? So on the one hand, right, we think of Sam making his, rabbit and potato stew and all this, right? But Sam is a tricky figure, right? In the letters, Tolkien says, Sam is quite annoying. He says he's the kind of in many ways he's the best and the worst of the hobbits. He's someone who is extremely narrow-minded. He has all the prejudices of the hobbits, right? So compare him with Frodo, right? And it's very interesting, right? Because when people meet Frodo, they'll often call him elf friend. And that's because Frodo is bookish, he can sing, he's interested in lore, whereas Sam is more your straight up country bumpkin. But it's that resilience of Sam that's going to get them across the finish line, right? Because ultimately, as you know, right, literally Sam carries Frodo on his back up to Mount Doom, right? Because Frodo's finished. So that's just to say, right, there are all of these interesting kind of subplots, right? Given the enormous architecture of good and evil, but then as you get down into the kind of the micro workings of the interactions, there's quite a lot of psychological and moral.
Yeah, that's so good. The book is Tolkien, Philosopher of War. As I said, it's not politically correct, but it is so good. You gotta get this and you gotta share it with your friends. And then if you don't carry a gun, for heaven's sake, go get one. And don't send me letters. I'm being facetious, okay? We're gonna do this some more on the other side of the break. Don't go away. Hey, thanks for spending time with us. By the way, if you enjoyed this show, you'll probably like our free weekly email. It's called Key Life Connection, and it delivers the best of Key Life right to your inbox. Try it out. You can go to keylife.org/subscribe, and we made it free on purpose so you wouldn't complain.
Graham, I noted, and you talked a lot about Tolkien's Catholic and spiritual background, certainly. And there was a point where you were bringing in the idea of Gnosticism and sort of contrasting that. There was a rubric, and I won't go through all of them, but one was dissatisfaction with the world. The problem is the world and not us. And then the belief that salvation from the world is possible. And contrasting Tolkien's approach to that in the midst of these apocalyptic stories and so forth. Can you talk about that
Great
some?
question.
Yeah, certainly. So you might recall from the movies, right, that Aragorn is something called Dunedain. He is a very special kind of a human being in that he lives for about 300 years. He has extra strength and endurance. And this is because, as a Dunedain, he belongs to this strain of humans, the Númenóreans, and they are the subject of the sort of origin story of all of Tolkien's work, this book called The Silmarillion. Parts of the Silmarillion were being written during the First World War. Certainly, if not in the trenches exactly, certainly when he was in hospital. The days when he was lucid, right? So trench fever is like having a horrible flu, and it's completely debilitating. But on the days that he was lucid, he was writing some of the core elements of the Silmarillion. And it's the story of the Númenóreans. And the Númenóreans, so they're these incredibly powerful, gifted humans. And the thing that they cannot tolerate is that they die. So they get it into their heads that even though they are told they must not go and visit the land of the gods, they get it into their heads that they will. They know they will meet resistance. So they create this enormous armada and they essentially attack the lands of the gods. Because what they believe, another word for the land of the gods, Valinor, is the undying lands. So they believe that if they can just get onto the island, they will live forever. So this is the kind of the Gnostic problem, right? The Gnostic problem is, so Gnosticism historically was a set of sort of philosophical and religious beliefs contemporary with the life of Christ. So it's not a heresy of Christianity, it's its own belief system that was in the area and the arena of the sort of the Roman Empire at the time that Christ was alive. So, but the sort of core of Gnosticism is a kind of a complaint about the cosmos, right? That our lives should be better. And why? Well, because we're amazing, right? So this is kind of the Númenóreans. They're like, wait a minute, we are so amazing. How is it we have to die?
Yeah.
So we know the gods have told us, don't come and visit us. You can do whatever you want, just don't come and visit us. And they say, no, let's go and visit them because we want to step on their land and we will have immortality. And so then what happens is the Armada is getting closer and closer to the ocean, to the islands. Some of the soldiers, in fact, step foot, the Númenóreans step foot, and God creates an apocalypse.
Yeah.
He creates a genuine destruction of a civilization. And the Númenóreans are obliterated, except for the few Númenóreans who were called the faithful. And they are the ancestors of Aragorn.
Huh.
So does that give a sense about the Gnosticism? And
Yeah,
that's so good.
and certainly brings it into the modern day
Does.
Gnostics. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. No, I mean, this is kind of what's cool, right? So this goes back, maybe to Kathy's question about technology, right? So if you think about techno science, right? The whole bioengineering world that is sort of like the kind of, you might just say, the belief system of the secular world today, right?
Gnostic. Yeah.
Science can re-engineer us to live, if not eternally, then something comparable. Then, yeah, that's Gnosticism. And Tolkien, not only did Tolkien write that into his stories, but he had plenty of sort of rivalries at the time that he was a young man. There were Gnostic elements very strong in the culture, right? And so I talk a lot about this futurist art movement that's the origin of Italian fascism. It was a thoroughly Gnostic movement. It was all about, so I'll just give this example because it's one that Tolkien kind of, I think, refers to. But they had these futurists, right? These artists had this idea of killing the moon. And how do you kill the moon? Well, what you do is you put massive searchlights into the sky so that when the human looks up at the cosmos, they don't see cosmos, they don't see creation. They just see a reflection of their own persons. They just see a technology looking at them, illuminating all reality, right? So it's a purely human self-referential system. And Tolkien knew about this art movement, and I don't think he liked it at all. And I think the Númenórean story is a kind of a version of his saying, look, we don't want this sort of stuff. This stuff is bad for us.
Jeremy?
Graham, I think this conversation is just fascinating. And as an uncle of two nephews that I raised on the Lord of the Rings movies, and then they grew up reading the books themselves, I speak to them in memes. And one of my favorite memes, and I would love a comment on this, is when you are young and you come across Lord of the Rings, you think you're Aragorn. As you mature, you start to think, well, maybe I'm Frodo. But when you really get it, you come to the humble realization you might be Gollum.
Well, we'd all love to be Aragorn, right? Why not?
Oh, sure.
And it is interesting, right, to think about the relationship between, say, Aragorn and Boromir, right? Because Boromir is also a great soldier.
Yeah.
He's a loyal, he's a patriot. But he's not as sort of strategically minded. He's not as obedient as Aragorn is to the wisdom of Gandalf. And so, you have this, so again, maybe to go back to Matthew's question, right? I mean, what are the sort of psychological subtleties? Well, the destruction of Boromir, the horror of Boromir's ending, right? Where he knows he has sort of betrayed the fellowship, and yet he dies in sacrifice trying to kind of rebuild what he has broken, right? I mean, it's a horrible sort of tragic way to die, right? So, I get the Aragorn thing. The Gollum thing, I don't get. I don't know. I can stay away from that one.
Maybe Sam.
Graham, we're out of time. That's a pleasant way to end it, in death and destruction.
Yeah.
It's on
Be
brand.
like Gollum.
You are a delight, and this is a great book. Thank you for writing it. You keep writing. We'll have you back on. And thank you for spending this time
so
with
much.
us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys, don't go anywhere. We're going to come back and we'll tell you who we're going to do it unto next week. And you, as this week, will be amazed. Great hour. We all love Tolkien, so we've loved it. I hope you have liked it as much. And if you haven't read The Fellowship and you haven't seen those movies, and they're very well done and absorbing, go see them. And don't just stop there at a good story of good against evil. Go deeper and think deeper about it. We live in a very superficial culture. And we don't even think there is evil unless it's a Republican or a Democrat, and we put a name to it. But there is genuine evil in the world. And there is a sense in which all of human history is the record of the battle, the kind of battle you'll find in Fellowship between good and evil. That doesn't mean that everybody on the good side are good, sweet, nice people, and the people on the bad are orgs. But there is evil, and there really is good. And sometimes, even if you're a pacifist, I read these books when I was leaning in that direction. And after I finished The Fellowship, I junked it all. I decided sometimes you got to stand. Sometimes there really is Hitler. Sometimes there really is evil. Sometimes there's some people that just needed killing. But anyway, that was a great interview, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. You gotta come up with something better next week.
Well, next week is just easy to be better because next week We have no guests.
Oh.
It's just us, and it is our Christmas show.
Oh, yeah.
So everyone will, no pressure, everyone will dress accordingly, be festive in their dress, and even more importantly, for some among us who shall remain nameless, will be festive in our attitude. because
humbug.
because there will be some festive things to partake of, or for the grammatically correct, of which to partake, but only if one has a festive attitude.
Well, it's going to be hard with that Christmas tree you put up in here. I don't know if I can do that.
Do we have to
Dress-
don we now our gay apparel?
Don we now our gay apparel,
You know
and
what, for
we'll
a
have
cookie, I'll
some,
do it.
and we'll have some fa la 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 as we go along, and we'll have some food.
Okay, you don't have to, but if you want to, we hope you'll join us next week.
What?
Well, I'm giving people freedom. That's what I'm about. Grace and freedom, okay? You don't have to, but it would be nice if you showed. Between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't, and that gives you a wide, wide berth.
Dress for the